Thanks so much for that kind introduction, Noreen. I've never blushed before while being introduced, but I just did. So that's an achievement. Thank you all for having me here today. It's a really nice opportunity to sort of introduce myself to the OPR community. I understand that in taking a seminar slot as a Princeton insider, I'm denying several people the opportunity to go to a nice dinner tonight on the Princeton time. So as you stare at your ordinary meal on tonight's dinner plate, please try to forgive me. So the results that I'm going to describe to you today are part of an ongoing research project that uses data from the demographic and health surveys to understand the links between the childhood family environment and outcomes in adulthood throughout the developing world. And Noreen mentioned that my original interests are sort of in the link between health and socioeconomic outcomes. And one of the peculiar things about studying the relationships between health and socioeconomic outcomes is that occasionally you notice things in the data that are worthy of interest that don't have much to do with health at all. And that's what I'll be talking about today. So the big picture question. I seem to have a. There we go. Okay. So the big picture question I'd like to pose to get us started concerns the link between family size and investment in children. Now, depending on your disciplinary background, you might think of this in terms of a quality-quantity trade-off, but some in this room might like to think of it instead as sort of a correlation between SIP size and sort of various child investment outcomes. But I'd argue that regardless of one's disciplinary background, this relationship between how many children parents decide to have and how many resources they decide to put in each child, that relationship is going to be crucial to just about any theory of the fertility transition we have. So it certainly factors into the economic theory of fertility. But I'd argue that it also factors into social or ideational theories of fertility transition. So today I'm going to set out a bunch of facts. I'll think a little bit about what theories underlie those facts, but this is going to be a talk mostly about a series of patterns in the data. Now, in particular, I'm going to focus on the association of SIP size and completed education. And I should mention before getting into things that I'll probably occasionally misspeak and use the term family size instead of SIP size. I mean the same thing no matter what I say. I mean the number of kids with the same biological mother. Now, this relationship between SIP size and schooling has received a lot of attention in a range of literatures in economics, sociology, demography, and the list goes on. And by and large, you get a quite consistent picture from rich countries, which is that SIP size tends to be negatively associated with educational attainment and with a range of outcomes in adulthood, right? So that kids from bigger families tend to do relatively worse. If you look at the evidence from developing countries, however, the evidence is decidedly more mixed. So in particular, there were a series of studies coming out of Africa in the late 80s and early 90s that showed that SIP size was either uncorrelated with school enrollment or was even in some cases positively correlated with school enrollment, which sort of turned the conventional wisdom on its head a bit. So my attention today is going to be on this cross-sectional association, which I think should be thought of as possibly reflecting an actual trade-off that parents face, and also encompassing the decisions of parents, the joint decision over how many kids to have and how much to invest in each of those children. So this should be thought of as an equilibrium association, rather than some sort of a causal effect of adding children to the family. But I should mention that over the past decade or so, actually there were a few papers much earlier on. There has been some attention to trying to estimate the actual trade-off that parents face. This is sort of the causal effect of increasing family size, holding everything else fixed. That literature has mostly come out of economics, although of late there have been some publications in demography that have looked at the same, that have tried to estimate the same parameter. That's not going to be my focus today. I'll return at the very end of the talk to think about where my evidence fits into this literature that's interested in causal inference. But for now, I just want to think about sort of the equilibrium decisions of parents to have kids and to invest in their children. And in particular, the focus is going to be on sort of reconciling those first two bullet points. The fact that you have a negative relationship in rich countries and a considerably muddier picture coming out of developing countries. At least my reading of the literature is that nobody's really been able to put everything together into any sort of systematic framework. And that's what today's talk is going to attempt to try to take a first stab at. There have been a few studies that have tried to find cases where the relationship between citizenship size and educational attainment is either changing over time within the country or varies between different subgroups within the country. There's the cases of Arabs and Jews in Israel and of blacks and whites in South Africa where you have different signed relationships. And then there are also a few studies looking over time across successive birth cohorts in Asia, which finds that if you look back far enough in history, you'll find a very weak relationship between citizenship size and educational attainment. And if you look in much more recent data, there's a strong negative correlation as we have in rich countries. So this is sort of where I'm going to situate myself today. I'm going to try to incorporate both these sorts of comparisons, both sort of cross-sectional comparisons across different areas and comparisons over time, to try to see if I can piece together any sort of a systematic picture or a coherent picture of what happens to these relationships over time as a country undergoes fertility transition. And in particular, I'm going to show you using a large number of household surveys on cohorts of women born between 1940 and 1990, that in fact these relationships do seem to follow quite a systematic pattern over time. And so I'll show you that if you look back far enough, in almost all of these 40 countries that I'll be analyzing, you will find a positive relationship between the number of children in the childhood home and subsequent educational attainment. But then as time goes on within that country, the relationship first goes to 0 and then eventually flips to become negative, so that kids from big families become relatively disadvantaged, whereas they were relatively advantaged for earlier cohorts. I'm not going to talk as much about the influence of birth order in today's talk, but it is something that I'll mention in passing. And I'll show you that birth order follows a somewhat weaker path over time, but it seems, if anything, to have gone in the opposite direction, so that it used to be good to be born early in your citizenship, whereas now it's good to be born later in your citizenship. And so the first half of the talk is going to be aimed at documenting these patterns and to figuring out where this transition happens first, and thinking about what other demographic forces are associated with this transition. So I'll show you that the transition, that these citizenship size educational attainment of relationships first started turning negative in Latin America. Then they got to Asia, and then most recently the correlations in Africa have started to turn negative as well. And consistent with this general pattern, if you look within country, it seems that it first turns negative for kids born in urban areas, and then eventually comes about for rural areas as well. And then the final part of the final point of the first part of the talk is going to try to relate these changes in the relationship across successive birth cohorts within the country to other sort of aggregate changes in educational attainment and demography. And so I'll show you that that in large part these changes correlate with other sort of aggregate changes in society and the economy, largely as one would expect, although there are some surprises. Although the association of these relationships, of these sort of SIP-SHIP-size education relationships with these underlying demographic variables is quite small quantitatively. So ultimately, I'm not going to be able to say very much about what is actually driving the change because my estimates are just too small to account for this really, really large change in the relationship over time. So as I mentioned, this talk is going to be mostly about facts and not so much about theory. I thought that would be okay with a group of demographers. I think that's sort of like the old style of like what OPR started out with in the early days, right? So there's a large focus on just documenting what's actually going on, and then we can start thinking about theory. But I would like to say that I do not at all think of these as reflecting a flip in the causal effect of family size. I think of these as reflecting some change in the composition of families who are making these joint decisions about how many kids to have and how much education to put their kids through. Hopefully I'll have enough time to get to this to get to the second part of the talk, where I'm going to show you that this flipping in the relationship between educational attainment and SIP-SHIP size has some very interesting consequences for fertility dynamics within family dynasties. And by family dynasty, I mean sort of this direct descendants of in the same lineage. And so in particular, the reasoning is kind of cool, I think. So we know, for example, that when fertility decline begins in the country, it first affects sort of the most educated women, right? So fertility starts to decline first among the most educated women. But I've just told you that for women born sort of in the pre-transition era, when the relationship between SIP-SHIP size and education was positive, those more educated women are going to come from relatively large families themselves, right? So the women who are first affected by fertility decline are going to come from large families, which means that in many cases at some point along this transition, you're going to get a negative relationship between childhood family size and adult family size, which sort of turns on its head the way the sort of conventional wisdom about these things. So I'll talk a little bit more about the fairly large demographic literature that dates back a century on correlating the family that correlates family size and the family of origin with family size and the family of procreation. But I just want to say that these patterns might help reconcile some of the findings we've seen in the literature. It's sort of interesting speaking to a group of largely non-economists, because if I had used those first few slides on a group of economists, I would have never been able to continue to actually describe the data. But you guys have been very patient, so let me tell you about what I actually do, now that I've told you sort of a preview of what I'm going to show you. So I'm going to use data from the demographic and health surveys. These surveys are probably known to most people in this room. They have a very tight link with OPR. So these are nationally representative surveys of women of childbearing age, typically, although not always, between age 15 and 49. And they've been conducted in a very, very large number of poor and middle-income countries around the world. So these surveys initially focused on fertility and child health. Indeed, that's still their primary goal. But over time, many of them started trying to collect data on adult mortality as well, trying to fill in the gap that we have in many poor countries due to the absence of good vital registration systems. And one of the main techniques for collecting data on adult mortality is the sibling history module, in which the respondents, who are these adult women, report a full roster of all the siblings that were born to their mother, all ever-born siblings to their own mothers. And so for each of their ever-born siblings, they report the sibling's age, the sibling's sex, the sibling's survival status, and also the sibling's age at death if the sibling died. So these were initially used primarily for calculating maternal mortality rates and have been used extensively in that regard. And more recently, they've also been used to study adult mortality during the HIV/AIDS epidemic in Africa. But what I'm going to do in this talk is use the data for another purpose, which is to use them to get a window into the childhood environment that these women experience as children, right? So you can actually construct the SIB-SHIP size, both the ever-born SIB-SHIP size and the surviving SIB-SHIP size, and also the birth order of women. And in other work, I've also looked at the sex composition of their siblings, although that'll be a separate issue which I won't address today. There will be some issue, of course, of recall bias, that women might not remember all of the kids that were born to their moms who died at a young age. But I'll show you that reporting of siblings who died before age 5 is actually non-negligible, and so it doesn't seem at face value that these data really miss all the kids who were born but later died. And so the results I'll show you today are based on this grouping of 85 surveys from 40 countries around the developing world, and that gives me close to 800,000 women. So I'm going to focus on women over age 20 because the assumption is that by age 20, women in most of these countries have finished their schooling. And by and large, so the vast majority of these data are collected on all women, sort of a full nationally representative sample. But there are a few samples where they collect data only on ever married women, and this creates an important sample selection problem because if I'm leaving out unmarried women when there are substantial shares of unmarried women, then I'll get an inconsistent estimator for what I'm trying to study. So in practice, this problem only affects four countries that have sibling history data. And so for 2 of them, Bangladesh and Nepal, it turns out that for women over 30, rates of non-marriage are so low that I don't have any issue. So I study these age 30 plus samples from Nepal and Bangladesh. So in both countries, less than 2% of women over that age are never married. But in Indonesia and Jordan, you have higher rates of never marriage. So I'm afraid I'm going to leave those countries out of this. It so happens that they follow similar patterns over time, but I want to be careful about what I'm showing you. So the one last thing I have to show you before I actually start showing you some results is some information on what I'm actually doing with these data. So I'm going to focus largely on the count of ever-born siblings as SIB-SHIP size. I'll show you at some point that the results using surviving siblings, so kids who have siblings who have survived the perils of the first few years of life, those results are going to be fairly similar to the ever-born results. But now I think there are justifications for using both. I think in a world where parents are perfectly targeting their number of children, then you probably want to use surviving SIB-SHIP. And in a world where parents are having children without any regard whatsoever to the final SIB-SHIP size, you probably want to use everborn. The reality is probably somewhere in between. I take solace in the fact that these actually don't seem to matter very much for the overall pattern of the results. But the basic idea is going to be to separate these individuals I, these women who are indexed by I, and to separate them by birth cohorts and countries. And so the birth cohorts, at first I'm going to separate them into decade or 2-decade birth cohorts. And then later on in the talk I'm going to separate them into annual birth cohorts. And I'm just going to estimate these simple relationships for each birth cohort by country cell. And so I'm going to regress the woman's highest grade on her SIP size, and on her birth order. I'll also show you some results that don't control for birth order. We could probably get into a nice debate about whether I should or should not control for birth order, but the pattern seems to be fairly similar regardless. So the DHS, a problem with the DHS is that they don't have very much information about what actually went on in childhood. There are some surveys that ask women about their sector of residence in childhood, whether they grew up in an urban or rural area. And so for those surveys, which are a pretty large majority of the surveys I analyzed, I'm going to estimate the same relationship and control for whatever I can in order to see whether this is reflecting some sort of change in sectoral composition of the population or something like that. And so in practice, I can't control for very much, but I'll control for exact year of birth when these cohorts are measured by decade. Then also some dummies for the mother's year of first birth. So I can't observe the mother's actual birth cohort, but I can observe the year she initiated childbearing. And then I'll also control for a childhood sector of residence. And so the next thing I'll show you is sort of the big picture story. You're going to see that these relationships, that these betas over here, these relationships between SIP size and educational attainment start positive in most countries and eventually flip to negative. I hope you guys can see all these things. I think actually this graph is taller than I am. So for each of these, what I'm showing you here, so I have countries on this y-axis, and then I have the coefficients for each of these categories of birth cohorts. And sort of the middle line, the middle blue line is the coefficient, and then the plot around it, the range around it, is the 95% confidence interval. And so what you can see here quite clearly is that if you look at cohorts of women born between 1940 and 1960, the relationship between SIP size and educational attainment is largely positive, right? In the vast majority of countries, this is a positive relationship. There are a few cases where it's negative, which might reflect actually that they've already transitioned to negative from positive. There are a few cases where it's exactly zero, but certainly in Africa, the relationship is mostly positive. Then as time goes on here, you start to see, the first thing you start to see is these coefficients from Latin America start to move downwards, right? They have this downward progression such that once you're at the end of the sample period, they're very, very strongly negative, whereas they're hovering around zero early on. Similar things seem to happen in some parts of Asia, although not in Afghanistan. And then in Africa, things remain positive through the 1960s, then turn to maybe roughly zero in the 1970s, and then turn largely negative in the 1980s. So I have a hunch that these are some new facts. I certainly didn't know them before I found them, but maybe someone in this room will be able to point out to me that these facts have been known for a long time. So I welcome that feedback, although be gentle if you give me that feedback. So meanwhile, if we look at the coefficients on birth order, and of course these are coefficients on birth order controlling for family size, holding family size fixed. These are a little muddier, but you see sort of the opposite pattern, that the coefficients were largely zero or negative back in the early cohorts, and then they eventually become positive as you move forward in time. And this is something that, to be honest, I've spent most of my time thinking about the SIP size correlations and not the birth order correlations. So I haven't given enough thought to the theories that might underlie this. I think there's a large number of theories, but I think there are still basically a number of open questions. But I'd like to sort of put this up on the shelf for now. We can talk about it later in the talk if you'd like. And I'd like to sort of piece through the SIP size educational relationship in a little more detail. So the first thing I want to show you is that if you calculate these relationships using ever-born siblings, which is the blue plot, or siblings who survived the first 5 years of life, which is the red plot, you get largely the same picture. So one thing is that I'm not adjusting for birth order here. And that's because every time I tried to think about how to calculate birth order among surviving siblings, my head started to hurt. It wasn't clear to me at what point to count them as alive or not. So this I thought would be useful also to show you how the results look if I don't control for birth order. So the first thing to note is that the blue and red plots are fairly close to each other. We'll look at that in a bit more detail on the next slide. The other thing to note is that the shift in coefficients is a little bit weaker than it was when we controlled for birth order, and that's precisely because the coefficients on birth order are moving in exactly the opposite direction, right? So that when we don't control for birth order, the association of SIP size is sort of being downweighted a bit by those late-born kids in the large families. So I actually think that a possibly nicer way to study the comparison of ever-born SIBs with surviving SIBs is just to plot out these coefficients against each other. And so that's what I'm doing here. So on the x-axis, I have the number of ever-born siblings, and on the coefficient on the number of ever-born siblings, and on the y-axis, I have the coefficient on the number of surviving siblings. And so I think there are a few important takeaway points here. The first is that they're very, very strongly correlated, right? So that's a good thing. That means that the results don't depend too crucially on whether we look only at surviving SIBs or whether we look at all ever-born SIBs. But the other thing to note is that the coefficient on surviving SIBs tends on average to be a little bit greater than the coefficient on ever-born SIBs. And you can see that this is the 45-degree line. So most of the points are above the 45-degree line. And in particular, that difference between the coefficient on surviving SIBs and the coefficient on ever-born SIBs is greatest when you have a positive relationship between family size and education. And that sort of makes sense if you think that the best-off families in this pre-transition era, the best-off families are both sending their kids to school and having lots of kids, right? Then those best-off families are also going to have lower child mortality rates, right? So that in this regime, when the relationship is positive, surviving SIB size is going to be more strongly correlated with parental socioeconomic status than will ever-born, right? Because the poorer families who have lots of kids are going to have some of those kids die off, right? So now I want to also take a few minutes to think about the role of covariates and of heterogeneity across urban and rural areas. Sure.
You mentioned that recall for the non-surviving siblings is pretty good, but is there any relationship between socioeconomic status and the
So one problem is that I can't observe socioeconomic status. One thing that occurred to me recently that I should do that I have not done is for countries for which I have multiple surveys, I can test the role of age in determining sort of the under 5 mortality rates of the reported siblings, right? Because I get to observe the same birth cohorts at multiple times, so I can see if as time progresses, people forget more and more of their siblings. That would be useful to do. But I should mention, by the way, that that these data are not telling me anything about sort of the distribution of family sizes when these women were children across families, right? This is telling me about the distribution of family sizes among women who have survived to adulthood, which is an important point as well. So in this figure, I'm back to controlling for birth order, but I'm also going to so the blue plot is the original plot I showed you on the first graph, and then the red plot is also going to control for childhood sector a precise year of birth dummies and dummies for the mother's year of first birth. And you can see here that when I control for this stuff, in large part it doesn't affect the coefficients very much. The one exception is Malawi, where the coefficient turns very, very negative without controls, and it's slightly less negative with controls.
Just clarification. When in the equation you put up,
Yeah.
it's like you had maybe a country year fixed it.
Right. So I mean, in fact, I'm estimating each of these separately as separate regressions, right? So the country year fixed effect is just the country specific.
Fixed effect.
It's just a country-specific constant, right? So
And for that particular year?
Yeah, but you're running a separate regression
For-
for each country year.
for each country year.
Country
These
year.
Yeah.
are the coefficients for these regressions.
Yeah.
Everything's interesting, including the country. Yeah.
And so the last thing I want to show you is this heterogeneity by the one other childhood background characteristic I have, which is rural versus non-rural areas. And the main takeaway point here, I think, is that especially in Africa, you see these women from urban areas really turn quite strongly negative. So I'm reducing the number of birth cohorts I look at because the samples for urban-born women are quite small. So I just wanted to reduce the number of cuts of the data I do. And you can see here that the relationship really seems to turn quite strongly negative in African cities, whereas the rural areas still hover around 0. Right? So it really seems to be that this thing happened earliest in Latin America and got to Africa latest, and within Africa it seems to have affected urban families before it affected rural families. So all of this sort of begs the question of what's going on here, right? So we have these patterns on the education SIP-SHIP size relationship. We also have some change in the education birth order relationship, although that's not going to be the focus of the rest of the talk. And so there are sort of a few sort of practical questions we might want to ask about what this actually reflects, and then there are some more theoretical questions. A practical approach to data is just to ask whether this reflects sort of movement along some nonlinear, non-monotonic curve, right? So that we actually have this stable relationship that we're just sort of estimating lines along different parts of that curve, or whether this relationship is in fact flipping over time. And then if that relationship is in fact flipping over time, can we find some sort of broader demographic forces that explain the change? So I'll first look at this question of whether we actually have a reversal in these relationships, or whether we're actually just sort of moving along these nonlinear curves as fertility declines. And so I'm just going to fit a very simple non-parametric specification where I just have a bunch of dummies for each SIP-SHIP size category and a bunch of dummies for each birth order. And I'm just going to estimate coefficients on each of those. And I'm going to estimate them by country for pre and post 1970 birth cohorts, and then average across countries. Sort of an issue that's going to come up again and again in the rest of the talk concerns whether I should be including everything in a pooled regression or estimating these sort of country by birth cohort. And I think the correct answer is that I don't want to take into account sort of the arbitrary sample sizes that the DHS chose to have in different countries. So I want to first come up with these results by country and then average across countries. And so here's what the relationships look like. So these are averages of the coefficients on each of the dummies across the 40 countries. And in the bottom here, I have the average of the histogram of family size across these countries for the pre-1970 cohorts and for the post-1970 cohorts. And so the pre-1970 cohorts are in blue. And so you can see here that there seems to be a pretty regular increasing pattern across SIP-SHIP sizes. So by the way, the coefficients at 0 for both the top two graphs are normalized to be 0, right? Because each of the other coefficients is testing against the only child family. And so as you increase in family size, you see this sort of increasing trend. Whereas for the post-1970 cohorts, it seems to be bad to be from a one-child family, although there are very, very few kids from one-child families. But once you get out of that one-child range, increasing family size tends to be associated with less educational attainment. Meanwhile, you see here a general negative trend in birth cohort, although things get quite noisy for the pre-1970 cohorts once you get to very high birth orders. or very high family sizes. But this relationship seems to rotate upwards, at least for somewhat larger families, right? So that it still seems to be better to be born first than to be born second, holding family size fixed. But as you move on, the later born kids within families tend to do better than the earlier born. So this says that there, and by the way, you can see here that there's a slight downward shift. So this curve is largely this blue curve for the pre-1970 cohort is largely to the right of the red curve, although there is this one pesky point here. So that average family size has decreased, but only between the pre and post-1970 cohorts.
So what's pre and post? I mean, how many years are in each of those?
So pre is sort of 1940 to 1969, and post is 1971 to 1990.
Isn't it a little surprising that they're declining?
So it surprised me a bit too, but that's largely because I hadn't thought enough about African fertility trends. So
Is this just Africa?
it's not just Africa, but you saw that the lion's share of the countries in my sample are African, right? So I don't think I'll have time to show you the
But these
plot.
are just weighted, each country is one.
Is one, yes.
They're not population weighted.
They're not population weighted.
Yeah.
That's right. I think the population weights would be also a little arbitrary because this is not the world population that I'm analyzing. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the relationship of these changing patterns to other demographic forces. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to estimate these for each annual birth cohort by country pair. Estimate these betas, right, and then relate the betas to the average educational attainment of that birth cohort, the average citizenship size of that birth cohort, and also the mortality rate, the child mortality rate among siblings in that cohort. This is not completely satisfactory, but I think these are probably the best measures I have of what's going on demographically some 50 years ago in many of these countries. And I'm going to include country and year fixed effects. So these are going to be identifying sort of how these coefficients change over time and how that change over time relates to other sort of aggregate average changes in these demographic variables.
It's not just low, but I mean, that beta has come from regressing education on SIP size.
That's right. That's right.
And I guess because you had the alpha PCs in there, these averages are not in there as well somehow, but I'm a bit worried about regressing, one variant of X and another variant of X.
That's right. So in general, right, so if you have measurement error, for example, in SIB size, then the measurement error is going to appear here, right, but it's also going to be sort of in the denominator here, right? And that's going to present some issues. But I still think that the results are going to be somewhat interesting to look at. We should talk about it more afterwards because I'm curious to hear your thoughts about it. So here's what the results look like. So for in this first column, I'm just reporting to you the averages across all these country by birth cohort cells. And so you can see that the education SIP size coefficient averaged across all cells is very close to 0 because you have a bunch of positives and a bunch of negatives. The average of the country cohort average educations is about 4.5 years of schooling. The average citizenship size is close to 7. And the under 5 mortality rate, this is where things get a little fishy. It's a bit low, I think, to have an under 5 mortality rate of about 100 per 1,000. One thing I should note is that, of course, this is an underestimate of, even if this were correctly measured, it would be an underestimate of overall under 5 mortality because under 5 mortality is probably clustered in households, and those children don't survive to adulthood. The second thing I show you here is just a country level, the average of the country level trends in all those variables. So this is just fitting a linear trend within each country where each of these variables is a dependent variable. So this is just to tell you sort of like on average how much these variables are changing over time, right? And so you get that education is increasing somewhat surprisingly, as Angus and I just talked about, fertility seems to be increasing slightly on average as well, right? And this might be some mix of overall fertility rates not changing much in Africa, but it might also be about older women not remembering all of their siblings. But at the same time, it's not all about older women not remembering their siblings who died early in life, because child mortality rates are strongly declining over time. So it does seem that the older women are reporting more of their siblings who died, but there's a question of whether they reported all of those siblings who died. And then in this last column, I'm estimating that regression, which shows you that increases in average education are negatively associated with this coefficient on SIP-SHIP size, right? So that as education rises, the SIP-SHIP size education relationship becomes more negative. Furthermore, the SIP-SHIP size, the coefficient here, is positive, so that as fertility falls, the relationship also becomes more negative. So these are both sort of consistent with the idea that as education levels rise and as fertility falls, you'll get more and more negative relationships, right? Then finally, this result for under 5 mortality I find a little puzzling, and I haven't completely gotten to the bottom of it. This is saying that as mortality falls, the relationship actually turns more positive, which is quite peculiar to me, and I haven't gotten completely to the bottom of it.
There's a time trend, there's a first cohort, second cohort that?
In this, yes.
So it's not as one goes down, the other goes up. It's as one goes down more, the other goes up more.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's right. And so I think I'll actually have to hold off on showing you the results for the dynamics of fertility within family dynasties. But I guess I'll just spend a few minutes talking about how we should think about interpreting these coefficients. So one thing I want to note before I move on from this slide is that if you want to try to see how much of the change in the education SIP size relationship can be explained by changes in these other variables, you have to sort of multiply this trend by this coefficient, and you'll get essentially 0. I mean, one problem is that SIP-SHIP size seems to have been increasing slightly across these birth cohorts within this sample, which means that these are not explained yet by a decline in aggregate fertility rates. But on the whole, these coefficients are quite small, and so when you multiply them by these time trends, you really get hardly any change at all. So although education and SIP-SHIP size seem to be related to these changes in the equilibrium relationship between family size and schooling, it doesn't seem that those forces really can explain the really large-scale change that we've seen from a positive regime to a negative regime. So let me just conclude, I guess, by saying a few words about what might actually be going on here. And this actually, so I'm leaving out the second part of my talk, but I think this will actually be a nice place to stop, because this will be sort of a good stepping off point to having a conversation about these patterns and to getting your ideas about what these might reflect. So we find that the education SIP size coefficient is negatively related to average education. So one way to interpret this would be that the highest status families in the society are the first to take advantage of new schooling opportunities, and so when new schooling opportunities arise, they sort of shift away from investment in child quantity and instead invest in child quality, right? So one way of looking at this actually is from an educational supply perspective, which is sort of in the tradition of John Caldwell, who argued that as educational opportunities become more available, right, this leads parents to shift to spending more on their kids, increasing child costs, right? That's sort of an educational supply story. Whereas you might also think about some sort of broader technological change that would increase the return to investing in education, in which case you might also get rich parents shifting away from investing from having lots of kids to instead investing a lot in a smaller number of kids. The other thing is that this education SIP size coefficient is positively related to average SIP size. And so this again can be related to sort of the basic economic model of quality and quantity, right? Which might give you reason to believe that that the richest families, the highest status families, are the richest or most educated, whatever families, are the first to shift from having lots of kids to having few kids, right? So that in the earlier regime, better off families were having lots of kids, and then once the environment becomes right for it, those better off families switch to having few kids. So there is some related work on this, on the changing relationship between wealth and fertility over the demographic transition. And there's certainly some strong evidence from Europe that suggests that if you go back far enough in time, rich families in Europe used to have more kids than poor families. And sometime around 1750 or 1800, that relationship flipped. There's also some evidence from a broader range of countries. This author Skirbeck has a nice review of a nice sort of meta-analysis of the literature on wealth and family size. One thing that I think is probably quite important, if these models are relevant, is the increased labor force participation of women, right? So that rich families switch from being relatively wealthier to being families for which women have a high opportunity cost of time. And so that might explain this flip, right? That's at least what Becker hypothesized in his original book. But you could also, of course, see this relationship with average SIP size as reflecting access to fertility control technologies, right, or fertility control ideas, or so on, right? And this would be sort of more consistent with the longer term view that's been coming out of population studies, that things like ideas about controlling fertility, about fertility being in the conscious choice, and also having access to and finding it useful to reduce fertility as being important, right? And that those technologies might also reach the highest status families first, right? So that you go from having educated kids being in big families to having educated kids being in small families. But I should note that that even in this situation, you still have to have something that explains the fact that the relationship between SIP size and education was initially positive, right? There still has to be something that gets you that first basic fact. The final point, which I'm still puzzling over, is this negative relationship with child mortality rates. I have a hunch that part of it might be mechanical. It might be reflecting women's recall errors, so that the oldest women are going to be coming from this positive regime, right? And they might also be the most likely to not remember their siblings who died in early childhood. And this might explain some of the sort of counterintuitive findings I found on that front.
Are there mothers who don't remember their children dying?
This is women remembering their own siblings who died in early childhood, right? Yeah, that's right. So let me actually just I should probably wrap up. I'm going to do something I shouldn't do and just show you one more graph without much motivation. And this is so on the x-axis here I have the education SIP size coefficient, which is what we've been looking at this whole time. And on the y-axis, on this one, I have the relationship between SIP size and the completed fertility of women. So for completed fertility, I'm looking at women over 40. That's sort of arbitrary. Some women might be continuing fertility, but I just wanted to get some measure of how many kids they have when they're in late middle age. And over here, I'm looking at all the women in my sample and looking at how many at their reported ideal family size, right? And so what you can see here is that when the education SIP size coefficient is positive, the relationship between the woman's desired fertility or completed fertility and her SIP size can become negative. so that you get these flips within family dynasties, so that women who grew up in large families can end up desiring smaller families of their own, and can end up actually having smaller families of their own. This fact that sibship size is very strongly related with education can in part explain these sort of muddied results that we obtain when we try to correlate adult family size with child family size. I had lots of other stuff that I wanted to talk about, but that's always the case. I hope you've found this informative. I'm certainly still trying to dig myself out of a whole bunch of patterns from a whole bunch of countries, and I'd welcome any thoughts you have on theories of where this might come from. Thanks very much.